All right, folks. Well, thank you again for being on time. I think there will be some other folks who will join us in progress, but for now, I do want to go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Brian Brennan. I'm the executive director of the 21st Century Alliance. We are an organization that's about 2 years old that is focused on 3 areas of California public policy: building housing, improving our K-12 student outcomes, and creating a strong and sustainable business and fiscal climate here in the state. And it's in that third category, of course, that we're convening the discussion here today. Many of you will know Gabe Petek, who has now been our legislative analyst for several years. And I like to say that he is the one charged with speaking truth to power in Sacramento. The legislature relies on him to give the straight story about our fiscal health in this state. And as some of you may have seen from the news reports over the last few days, the state of the state's finances are in a bad way. So it's a really good time to hear from him. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Gabe and let him take over. Gabe, I'm going to go ahead and pin you to the screen, and we'll be very grateful to hear what you have to say. There will, by the way, I should say, be time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you would prefer to message me or message the group with your questions, that would be perfectly fine. Or we can also do those kind of on the fly by either raising your hand physically or via the mechanism on Zoom. We are recording this session as well, so please be aware of that. And so with that, Gabe, thank you again for being here. Thank you for your leadership in Sacramento and all the work you do on behalf of the citizens and the legislature of this state. Please take it away.
Hey, Brian, could I just take 30 seconds?
Oh, sure. Steve Wesley, former state controller and founder of the 21st Century Alliance. Please, Steve, jump in.
I did 2 things. One, I just wanted to genuinely thank everybody being here. It's really important for democratic government to work in California, and that only happens when significant people like yourselves focus in on the issues and are really looking out for the best interests of the state. That's why I created the 21st Century Alliance. I just wanted to note, as a citizen, one who was lucky enough to take part of the system to be elected state controller, chief financial officer, I was actually there in 2003 when the state's bonds went into one step above junk bond status. We were in a position we were getting ready to give vouchers to the state's 320,000 employees. It was a debacle. And I guess if you have a company whose bonds are about to attain junk status, that's a disaster. When you have the world's 5th largest economy, it's a disgrace. Gabe Petek is the truth teller. He is the person who has his finger on the pulse of the numbers, whose job it is to warn and work with the state legislature to help make sure they don't make the same mistakes that the legislature made in 2001 and 2. So I'm really delighted to have him. And Gabe, if you could not only share your thoughts on the numbers, what's going on, the magnitude, but perhaps suggest to the extent you can, given your position, what people of conscience can do and what you can do to help move the legislature to move us beyond the roller coaster budgeting system we've had. So maybe a review, not just quantitatively of the numbers, but giving us some advice on coaching on how we can help you move the legislature, what you're doing, and how we can help empower you. But Gabe, take it away. We're very grateful for your coming to share time with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Controller Wesley. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to join you all today. It's important. It's a very important conversation, and it's one that is a little bit delayed this year. Normally, our office releases our fiscal outlook in November before Thanksgiving. But as you know, this year the tax filing deadline was pushed from April to October and then from October to November. And so as we were preparing our analysis, it became clear that tracking the daily collections, it became clear that there was something off, that we really felt a responsibility to hold back and make sure we had the best information we could. So ultimately, we released our report yesterday. And prior to that, on Friday, we released an analysis of our updated revenue estimates, which you may have heard about as well, because that's a direct input, major input to the fiscal outlook, which puts together the revenues and the spending to come up with a budget position estimate. So anyway, I think what I'd do is start by just telling you the central message of this report is that the state faces a serious budget challenge, a serious budget problem for the upcoming budget cycle, which will begin in January and will culminate in the adoption of a budget for the fiscal year 2024-25. And in that budget, the Constitution requires the legislature and the governor to agree to a budget that closes any projected budget deficits for that year, but also any that have emerged in the last year or two, actually, from beginning with 2022-23, the current year, and that upcoming budget year. So the Constitution really requires us to solve whatever problems we estimate exist for this budget window, which is how we refer to it. And specifically for that period of time, we are estimating that the state has a $68 billion budget deficit that will need to be solved before a budget can be completed for the upcoming fiscal year. Now, I'll walk through the major components of how we get to that number in a moment, but I do think it's important to spend a minute on the main source of the problem, which is that we did release last Friday a $58 billion downward adjustment to our estimated revenues for this period, this 3-year period. Compared to what we thought in June when we adopted the current year budget, our revenues are now estimated to be coming in about $58 billion below what the budget assumed at that point in time. And I think it's a very reasonable question. It's one that my bosses, the members of the legislature, have been asking, and others, but like, what is going on here? Because, you know, another good data point today came in on the national economic picture as far as jobs. We had a pretty good jobs report, and so far we haven't really seen the national economy. You know, there's been a lot of worry about whether we would have a hard landing as the Fed tries to manage interest rates, bring down inflation, but so far that hasn't really happened. If anything, some of the news that has come in has continued to be sort of positive. So a lot of people have been asking us, how does that make sense given what you're telling us about revenues? And the first thing I would say is that there's a certain amount of reversion to the mean effect going on here, because in the prior 2 years before, in 2021 and 2022, the state experienced such strong revenue growth. It was extraordinary revenue growth. In 2020, 2021, that fiscal year, and then the subsequent fiscal year that ended in fiscal 2022, we had 30% revenue growth followed by 20% revenue growth. So if anything, if you were to draw a trend line, those would actually look like kind of a big spike upward. And now where we're coming back is a little bit more like a little bit more in line with the longer term trend than it is really a drop off. But it is a drop off because we calibrated some of our budgeting to those higher numbers, of course. The second issue is that it seems like, from what we're gathering, I think many of you may have great insight to this as much as us, but you know, we think the economy here in California does reveal itself to be particularly sensitive to changes in the interest rates or tightening of monetary policy. And it appears to have curtailed a lot of the investment activity that we saw into the high-tech sector. And so we see reduced, we don't have great insight to the actual who's paying the taxes just yet. That there's a lag, but from what we can tell, it does appear there's been a large pullback in the level of venture capital funding, and we do know that there was a very steep decline in the level of initial public offering activity, and those types of investments do associate with higher revenues for California in the forms of, you know, restricted stock units, stock grant options for highly compensated employees, and bonuses, and that kind of activity that's not just the stock market, but also still related to capital markets and financial market activity. And so we think that's playing a big role here. Also, speaking of the stock market, it was down 18% in 2022. And so now that, we're looking back at the data there, it does seem, that the state tax revenues were affected by that. The other thing that is very unprecedented about what we are facing here is the timing issue. I've mentioned it already, but around half of the revenue decline that I've mentioned, the $58 billion decline in the revenue estimates, 26 billion of it is attributable to the prior fiscal year, 2022-23. And this fact complicates matters a lot more than usual, because not only did we just become aware of this in November, the extent of the downturn, or the shortfall, I should say, because of the extended tax filing deadline, but also because it relates to a prior fiscal year, it does really complicate the legislature's ability to make adjustments. You think about it, if the revenues, we now know that the revenues were that much lower in a prior fiscal year. Well, the books are kind of closed on that year in some sense. Now we have some options, because in the budgeting world, you can attribute things to different time periods more than in a cash situation, but still, it does really complicate matters. And one of the things I've been reminding my bosses of is that, this delay in the tax filing is problematic. And if we had known, if the tax due date hadn't changed and it was in April, we would have had the same information back in April, and we would have told you about this problem, and the legislature would have at least been forced to grapple with that fiscal year's part of the problem at that time. But instead, now we're this many months forward, and we're just learning of that problem and specificity, and so now we have to deal with it on a retroactive basis, which is logistically difficult. That all being said, I will, Controller Wesley was talking about those earlier difficult times, especially from a cash position. So I would like to say that despite the severity of this revenue drop, which in percentage terms, when we're looking at income tax in particular, is not so different from the percentage decline that we saw at the time of the Great Recession, for example. When we started the Great Recession, we saw around a 20% drop in income tax, and that's kind of what we're showing here. That all said, the state is entering this period on a much solider fiscal footing than at that time. Our reserves are much healthier, and we have a much stronger cash position. The controller's report for November shows that the state has $91 billion of borrowable cash in various funds of state government. And so we are not in a position where we're going to be having to, issue IOUs and that sort of thing at this, certainly not any time in the foreseeable period here. However, we do think that the problem and these options that the legislature have should be managed judiciously. And the reason I say that is that not only do we face a $68 billion budget deficit for this upcoming budget cycle, we also face approximately $30 billion annual deficits after that for the subsequent 3 years. And so those are, very uncertain. Those are based on our best estimates at this time. And then we're going to have a lot more information come May, when we have, assuming the tax due date doesn't shift again. But, those, if those were to materialize, we really think it would be valuable for the state to keep some of its powder dry, as it were, for dealing with that stress as well. And so that's why we're not, in this particular document, it's more of a table setting document, and it's more of a problem definition document. I'm sorry, I won't be able to say what we're saying. We don't have specific recommendations right now for how the legislature should solve this problem. We have in the document described a menu of some of the options that are out there just from a fiscal standpoint, but they will have to work through the decision-making process, and maybe we'll get to the point where the LAO needs to offer recommendations, but I think it's appropriate to first see what the governor is going to say and then begin the conversation with the legislature in a month or so, a little over a month. But I did mention, so $68 billion problem. What are the components of that? It is a little bit, there are parts of it that are a little confusing, but let me just walk through some of the big categories just so you can kind of appreciate how we got here. So first of all, 58 billion in lower revenues. That's obviously a major driver of this problem. But secondly, if you rewind back to June when we did adopt the budget at that time, the multi-year estimates associated with that budget showed a $14 billion deficit for the fiscal year 24-25, which is what we're talking about now. So we really started in the hole, if you think about it from that perspective. So we had a $14 billion problem, then we added to begin with, then we added 15 billion in problem with lower revenues than we expected. And related to that, when we go back in time and look at it, there was an adjustment made by Department of Finance to the entering fund balance for the 2022-23 fiscal year. They brought it down by 3 billion, so that they now realize it was lower by 3 billion than they thought. So yeah, you have to add that to the problem too. So that if you add those numbers up, you get to about 75 billion. But that number is then modestly offset by a couple of things. One is that our spending trends, particularly in the areas of health and human service agency costs, are actually coming in a bit lower than what was assumed at that time. That takes about 4 billion away from the deficit. And then also when revenues are down, we typically have a smaller Proposition 98 obligation because it's a formula-based funding requirement. In this particular case, it reduces our problem by about 4 billion. So 4 billion in lower spending on programs, 4 billion in lower Proposition 98. You take that away from the 75 billion that I mentioned, and that's how we get to around 68 billion in problem. Now, some of you, I'm sure, may be wondering, normally, when you see a decline in revenue, you should be getting a larger automatic reduction in the constitutional spending requirement for a Prop 98 for education. Normally, for every dollar of reduced revenue, you would see that obligation reduced by about 38 cents. But I just told you that it's only coming down by about 4 billion. And the reason for that is that it applies to the prior fiscal year. So it applies to 2022-23. And, this creates some challenges because there's no automatic mechanism in the constitutional formula or statute even for us to reduce on an automatic basis our constitutional spending requirement for education for a prior year or even the current year. Now, the legislature this is where I was saying at the beginning, the legislature could go back in time actually and say, although we budgeted Prop 98 at a certain level, the revenues came in lower, we're going to reduce that amount of funding under Prop 98, even for the prior year. This is very disruptive, however, for the school districts. They've already been dispersed all the funds. It would really disrupt their budgets in the subsequent years. So, but if you don't lower that prior year, it sets the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee on a higher base for the years going forward. So it's a conundrum. If we were to lower it to the constitutional minimum, it helps us solve about $17 billion of the problem of this $68 billion problem. And so the question is, how do you do that without being completely disruptive to the school districts? The idea that we did mention in this report, again, we're not recommending this per se, putting it out there as an option, is that the legislature could take from, in addition to our rainy day fund, we have a Proposition 98 reserve. And what we could do is reduce the Proposition 98 funding to the minimum guarantee but then use the funds held in the Prop 98 reserve to sustain those school district budgets. So in effect, from a state standpoint, the budget would not experience savings, but the school districts would be kind of protected from that. Now, going forward, their Prop 98 budgets would be lower, but they wouldn't be forced to, make drastic reductions on a mid-year basis or something like that. So we think it's something they should consider. And I'm sorry, it is kind of complicated to even walk through, but it's really very, very important. We think it's going to be a key discussion point in the upcoming legislative discussion. So that's why I mention it. In addition, what we just put in our document is that we do have $24 billion in general purpose reserves. We would recommend using no more than about half of those, which could be available if the governor declares a fiscal emergency, which we think the conditions would support. And then in addition to that, there's about $9 billion of one-time spending that was put into the plan for 2024-25. And so, to the extent that the state wanted to, or the legislature wanted to protect core safety net services of state government, it could consider pulling back on those one-time spending allocations without disrupting some of the core services that government provides. Lastly, there's the standard playbook of some cost shifting, internal borrowing, temporary revenue increases, if, for example, such as suspending the use of net operating loss deductions by corporate taxpayers, these types of things, which we've seen before, and we'll be helping the legislature with those specifics if that comes up. But I think I can stop about here because, again, we lay out this menu of options. We want to put it on the table, and but we also kind of want to respect the process a little bit in the sense that the governor has a role to play here, quite obviously, and then we do want to be responsive to first unpacking what he proposes, and then also seeing kind of how the discussion unfolds in the early part of January.
Great.
So
Gabe.
I know there's probably some questions. I think, Brian, you sent a couple even yesterday. So I don't know how you would like to proceed, but
Gabe, let's go ahead and try some of our real-time questions.
Okay.
I see Andrew Peterson, I see Tom Fallon just right out of the gate. So why don't we start with Andrew and then go to Tom. Andrew, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks so much again for organizing this. I always find these conversations very elucidating. And I've been involved in this for a few years now. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the structural problems with California's budget. Because it seems to me, we talk a lot about boom and bust. And one of my hobby horses, of course, has been budget reserves, not just at the state level, that school districts are limited in how much in reserve they can carry. So, that's one component of it. But as we think about this over the long term, aren't there some major things that we can think about accomplishing in the next 5 or 10 years to make sure that in the next boom cycle, we are able to put more resources into reserves so that, when these deficits or these changes or the necessarily kind of lumpy revenue installments the state gets, it's not going to be, such a whiplash kind of situation.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something we think about a lot. I mentioned in these remarks how once we get past this budget problem, there's $30 billion in annual deficits. If the legislature takes some of the steps I mentioned, or were to use that option I referred to about Prop 98, it could shrink that $30 billion somewhat. And there's a lot of uncertainty about it. Maybe it won't materialize to that extent, but the basic point you're making is right. But the state faces some real constitutional constraints here because going into this, before we knew, and in the last couple of years, I don't know if you remember this, but we were warning about the state appropriations limit constraints that we had. So that's when we had particularly strong revenue growth, and our spending was up against this state appropriations limit, and even money that we put into our budget reserve counts as spending. So in those boom times, we are in a situation where we are limited on what our options are, even including saving for the future. Now, we have done a better job of that in the recent past decade or so, but we were approaching the limit on that before this downturn started happening in the revenues. So it's a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't, because on the upside, we face this state appropriations limit, and then on the downside, well, we're looking at the downside, and that's not good either. So it's sort of we have some institutional challenges in this area. One of the other things that we have wanted to mention over time, we have mentioned, is that booking a lot of multi-year spending into temporary programs or one-time allocations. I think many people did that under the belief that that was more prudent than putting it into ongoing programs. And I think it is, if that's the comparison, but it's still spending that is on the schedule. We're scheduled to spend it. There are strong constituencies that are for those spending commitments. And so I think it's not so easy to pull it back, which is one of the whole ideas, right? Is that if you put it to one-time spending and then you run into a fiscal problem, you can pull that back without disrupting programs. Well, if you're not willing to pull it back, then you're not really benefiting to the degree you would have hoped from having programmed it into temporary areas. So that's something we've become a little more sophisticated, I think, as in terms of thinking about. And so these are all the kind of topics we've been contemplating, and I think it's related to your question. So I don't know if that's wholly satisfying, but that's kind of how we've been thinking about these issues of the structural problems.
Yeah, no, I think I just
thank you.
Yeah,
I'm gonna Andrew, if it's okay, because we have limited time, I want to move to Tom Fallon, and then I've had a couple of questions come through the chat that I'd like to share. So Tom, jump in, please.
So I'd also like to echo Andrew's thanks for organizing this, Brian and Steve. Interesting information. Gabe, thank you for your time. I appreciate you clarifying certain things, the revenue problem. I understand in the VC funding, I understand the IPO market, but we're basically at full employment. So I think we should have pretty good tax revenue from what's fairly predictable. Have you guys pieced apart how much of this shortfall of revenue is a permanent shortfall because companies and wealthy people are leaving California?
Yeah, now that is a good question that we get, and we don't know in this current period. We just don't know yet. We don't have the data. We don't get it. There's a lag before we get the specific information about who's filed. What I can tell you is that in 2021, we had the largest year of outmigration among the high income taxpayers that we've seen. And so, whereas in the past, I think you may have heard me and my colleagues and others say, well, most of the outmigration is occurring among the lower income or lower taxpayers. Now it's more even across the income distribution. That being said, at the same time, I should say, is that we had in that 2021 year, our income taxes grew by $27 billion. So whatever it was, the people that were leaving probably cost us in the range of $3 to $4 billion at the upside is what we estimate. And so that may have been, would have had a $30 billion growth instead of 27. So now the kind of decline we're talking about here this year, you would really have to be orders of magnitude more. It's sort of implausible to me that the main explanation is all because of even more people leaving. But I do think those people, these taxpayers, probably just have lower incomes this past year for the types of income that they earn. And so that's kind of what we know about it at this point, but we definitely see it as an issue. I mean, I think it's no longer a case where you could sit here and honestly say that we aren't losing some taxpayers because of
And it's not just people, it's companies too. And I think,
Yeah, well, companies too, yeah.
and I think it's paramount in your role that you do some predicting about that, because current course and speed, I'm a big believer that California doesn't know how to control spending. They do know how to raise taxes. And I think that I worry that you talked about, eliminating something for companies around taxable things, et cetera. It's the constant theme within California. I'll just tax more versus cut my spending. When you talked earlier in June, you said, well, we're having a reversion back to the mean. Well, I'm a big believer in reversions back to the mean. I would expect that the forecasting office would also believe in reversion back to the mean, instead of just drawing linear lines out of saying, hey, good times are good, and we forecast that to last for a while.
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything you're saying. Yeah.
Brian, can I just jump in on that?
Yeah, please. We've had a couple of other questions to that point as well. So Steve, come in via the chat. Please go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, no, I'll be brief. I just gave, again, I lived this myself, and back in 2000 and 2001, I really said record budget years. Gray Davis got reelected, a landslide. The bottom dropped out like that, and that's just because of the way our tax structure is scheduled, which is structured, which, as you know. I think I also want you to know, as a Democrat, I always heard from the Republicans, oh my gosh, you guys are spending wildly and people are moving out of the state. And to be honest, Gabe, 20 years ago, there really was no data that was going on. I will tell you what I have seen from all of our businesses, neighbors, people in precisely the areas that you are counting on for the state's budget. A number of people have left, or better stated, relocated to Austin, Miami, Incline Village, Sun Valley, Denver, than you would believe. It's stunning. And again, I think most people on the call get roughly 1% of the highest earners pay for 50% of the budget.
Right.
But what's more interesting to me and worrisome to me, and should be to you, is that I believe roughly 1/10 of that 1% is about a quarter of the state's budget. And it's those people that, if you live in an Atherton or Los Altos Hills, you're seeing a dramatic number of these people relocating. And so as you're thinking about, we've got these normal vicissitudes that go up and down. How do we deal with it? This is what we did before. This is what we're going to do again. Rainy day fund. And I remember the governor saying it's a record rainy day fund we're putting aside. And I was thinking at the time, this isn't going to cover more than 10 or 15 or 20% of what's coming. So I think you'd be wise to realize your normal safety valves may not be there. And as someone who weathered a tidal wave no one saw it coming, I'd urge you to pay a lot of attention. The last point is, we've been trying to get a lot of the data from the FTB on who is leaving, not individuals, but what part of that top 1% is going. We get that a lot of the people leaving are poorer people who are leaving because cost of living here is high. But to the extent you can get data on that top 1%, I think it would save you more headaches than you can imagine. And you can tell your progressive fans that the best thing we and you can do is to understand whether it's a little choppiness coming or a tidal wave, because you don't want to get surprised, as we did 20 years ago. You should be able to collect that data sooner than ever, but maybe you can comment on how quickly you might be able to get your hands on it. Because if you're looking at 2021 to gauge the future, my heavens, that feels like the dark ages to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant thing that we pursue and ask for. And yeah, there's about a 2-year lag. I mean, we just haven't been able to receive it before that. So, but what I can tell, the information that we have and what we're learning about it has caused us to give a different answer than we did 5 years ago. And we are trying to put this into the discussion, but still be based on, all of our work we try to do based on data and evidence. And so we're, that's it.
Yeah. And Gabe, I really want you to be data and evidence driven, but I just have to say, partly as someone from Silicon Valley who's in tech, partly as someone who's seeing what's going on now, and it's dramatic. I don't want you to take my word for it, but please do not accept that the state of California should never expect data more than 2 years after the fact. That's just, you need to throw that out. If I were you, I would be on a mission to get the data, not on everybody, but on the key people who are driving what's going on with the state. You must have that data sooner. Again, for those of us living, forgive me, Gabe, but in the private sector, I almost said the real world, but I don't mean that. In the private sector, you need to get the previous month's data, or rather quarters data, within 45 days, 90 days at the most at the end of the year, or you're going to jail. You got to have that data. But maybe the state's bigger and more complicated. We certainly get that. A 2-year lag in 2023, that has to be fixed. That's sort of a non-political thing. That's just that, let's get the state operating properly. But let me have other people a chance to jump in. It's an interesting time, and I know you're juggling a lot. Good. Bill,
Hey,
did you
thank you.
know who's in the queue?
There are a number of folks who have sent questions in the chat about our ability to forecast, and just kind of what we knew by the middle of the year. What you're thinking about in terms of improving our ability to forecast these things, because it really seems like October kind of snuck up on us, and that the magnitude of the shortfall, we didn't really have a sense. Even those of you who are following this, what are things that we can do to improve that ability to forecast?
Well, we're doing a lot of back testing different modeling exercises. And I guess what I would say about it is I think we did capture the inflection point. We didn't capture the magnitude. So we began warning about an economic downturn in May of 2022. And the whole point of that was that it would have a revenue implication. And then in May of this year, our revenue estimates were that we made a downward adjustment of $11 billion to the year. Our estimates were 11 billion lower than what the budget assumed, but they should have been 26 billion lower. So we missed that year, the one I've been talking about, the $26 billion downturn in the prior fiscal year. We missed by that much, by 17 billion essentially. And it's not ideal, but it's that's sort of, that's the way it played out. And I think it's been a challenge in California because of the nature of our revenues being kind of tied to capital markets or investment activity and things that we don't have. There's some opaqueness to that activity that we don't have the same insight as we do, say, as with the withholding tax collections, which come in monthly off of people's wages. But the downturn we did estimate was kind of predicated on what we were seeing even within the withholding taxes, because that is where we do see the collections on things like stock grants or restricted RSUs. Those once they vest, they get taxed off of the withholding side, not the estimated filings. And so we did have some indication, we just didn't capture the degree of the downturn, admittedly. So
No, great. Okay, Gabe, thank you. I see Rob Lapsley's hand up. Rob, you want to jump in?
Hi, good afternoon. Rob Lapsley, California Business Roundtable. So again, thank you to everyone and to Mr. Wesley's leadership on this. Gabe, thank you for an excellent overview, and the explanation on the Prop 98 guarantee was as good an explanation in the shortest amount of time that I have seen in quite a while. And I mean that sincerely. Just a quick question. Based on what you said, the workarounds, obviously the shifts, all the different tools in the toolbox, if you will, and what you see for the next budget year and potentially the following year, is there a need for a major tax increase? Or is there workouts that can be done so we don't have to go back to like a Prop 30 in 2012 for a major tax increase? In your opinion?
We're not putting anything specific like that on the table. No, I mean, so if you add up this menu of options that I gave, you could solve the problem, the $68 billion problem, with the reserves, pulling back the one-time spending, the Prop 98 adjustment, and utilizing some of those things like cost shifts, which means basically taking the cost that's currently residing in the general fund and placing it into a different fund, as long as it's legally allowed. But last cycle, when we were facing a smaller deficit, we got about 10 billion in general fund savings just by doing that. It's not a structural change, but it's a way of balancing the general fund budget. So anyway, my point in what I'm trying to say is that we can get to 68 billion in solutions through these things right now, and it won't solve those out-year deficits that I was talking about, the 30 billion, which would be lower than that, but just by adopting some of the changes that I mentioned. However, we aren't rushing to talk about solving the deficit of the future years, just because we do think it will be important to see a little more information, about where the economy is and where collections are a little later in the first part of the new year. So no, we're not saying that about a tax increase, Rob.
Thank you. And
Okay,
thank
Rob,
you
thank
for
you.
your work.
Let's go to, I see Bob Klein and Patrick Murphy. Bob, you want to jump in first, and then we'll go to Patrick?
Sure, thank you. So I imagine the solution to this is a mosaic with many different parts. And I was wondering what part of the revenue is from large real estate transactions in the state, because the major metropolitan centers like LA and San Francisco have put in place a huge increase in the transfer tax. And for example, in LA, it's just shut down major multifamily sales. So you have huge amounts of property that normally would have changed hands. LA had massive projections on how much revenue would be created out of those transfer taxes. And it's a small fraction of that that's actually happening. And that hits the state in terms of major income tax revenue on hundreds and hundreds of huge transactions on major real estate. And of course, it's going to compound the financial crisis with office buildings that go to refinance, because on many of these, that transfer tax may represent 25 or 35% of their equity or more. So what portion of the revenue from the state is revenue that's generated through major real estate transactions?
I don't know that offhand. We identify the commercial real estate sector as definitely a risk area for the state's economy and for the revenues. The transfer taxes themselves are more of a local revenue, and I don't have the breakout, like kind of what I was saying about the data, which, the controller Wesley's point is well taken, but I don't have the breakout of how much of it is tied to a specific sector in the way that you're asking. But I mean, it's a very good question. Yeah.
It's because those transfer taxes are going to stop massive amounts of sales of very large properties. And of course, at the municipal level, it'll compound your problems, because without property tax revaluations at the municipal level, it's going to hit their budget, which then creates a problem where they may have a hole in their budget that they look to the state to deal with.
Great. Bob, thank you. Gabe, thank you. Patrick Murphy, then we'll go to Pete Weber. Patrick.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks for putting this on as well. And Gabe, good to see you. A question for you and to some degree a follow-up on the question Rob asked, which is about tax increases, but maybe I want to sort of broaden that, and maybe I'll try to loop in the former controller on this too, Steve. Might it be time for a discussion about rethinking California's tax base as we ride the roller coaster once again, and in this time in record numbers, and maybe have that as a discussion that we can engage in, and maybe not let the good crisis go to waste?
Yeah,
Dave?
I mean, I don't know. I didn't know if you were waiting for Controller Wesley or.
Sure.
I'll let either of you jump in.
I'll give a quick word, Gabe, but you should jump in. The short answer is this is absolutely the time to do it. We've been going through a roller coaster budgeting cycle for some time. That's because politically, it's the easiest thing to do. Everybody, my business friends, community, say, my God, this is crazy. Why do we have such an acute up and down? The answer is, if you've ever run for office, the easiest thing to do is to tax the wealthy. It's a proven vote getter, especially in my party. What we need to do is get beyond that and distinguish. A progressive tax system is probably a good thing, but if you overload the top percent, especially the top 0.5%, those people leave and you run serious risk, which is why I would urge Gabe to see if there are ways he can get more data sooner. I don't want him to veer left or right or make precipitous judgments. I just want to get the data out sooner. But I think if there is a real retrenchment, an ongoing budget deficit, that is a good time to reconsider and try to get the Democratic leadership to understand, even for those who represent progressive communities in a progressive state, that there are ways to hold true to your values, but to restructure the tax code in a way that's not quite as dependent on capital gains income, because it just makes it almost impossible to fly a plane. It's sort of like saying we have a good pilot. Unfortunately, we've tied his hands to the back of the chair and he may not be able to adjust to any emergency you see. Hope everybody on the flight's comfortable with that today. Good luck. So that's what we're hoping to fix forward. Through Brian's great work, we're quietly meeting with a lot of the Democratic legislators to say, hey, we don't want to change your orientation, your values, but if your North Star is being progressive, one of the most progressive things you can do is make some common sense changes that can help us avoid these huge peaks and troughs. And they're not all one direction for sure. But what we worry about is, could there be a stacking of negative events, i.e. prolonged budget dip, maybe for geopolitical reasons we can't control, at precisely the same time wealthy people are moving out of the state. And then you just don't have the ability to right the ship. And I will tell you firsthand, we were precious close to a real disaster when I was a controller. I never dreamed when I was getting my MBA that I would be going hat in hand with the Tim Moody's and the others. And they were incredulous because they didn't trust our legislature. But the Republican governor and I were able to fix it. I'm hoping to avoid that scenario for the current crop because it wasn't a very fun trip.
Steve, thanks. Gabe, anything you want to add on?
Well, I would say a lot of that type of work, actually, I do think falls. I mean, it's good to come from like the kind of people that are on this call. I mean, our job, I think what we do is provide an analysis of the implications of the revenue structure that we have and try to indicate the risks that are at play because of it. What we've said is in 2024-25, the revenues could easily be 15 billion higher or lower if you look at the historic patterns than what we're estimating. That's just a really wide range. But within a couple of years after that, our estimates could be that the actuals could be 30 billion higher or lower. It just widens out the further you go. So it's not a stable source of revenue. But it's also the one the voters have chosen over and over. They passed Prop 30. They passed these taxes. They also passed Prop 2, which set up a rainy day fund mechanism. So the idea being you have revenues that are volatile, but we'll try to build a cushion to offset that volatility. We all know the kind of volatility that we're talking about here today cannot be covered just from a rainy day fund. But I'm just saying that's part of this is a very, there are politics involved. And I think our best role is to kind of, when we're asked the question, try to be able to describe the risks that are at play and involved. And but some of the work like that you're talking about, as Controller Wesley said, conversations you're having with people here in Sacramento, I think this is probably a productive way to go.
Great. Gabe, thank you. I want to go to Pete Weber, and then I'm going to interject a question as well. Pete, please.
Thank you. So Gabe, first of all, thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Helps us clearly understand what's going on. I've got a couple of questions I want to take up with you offline that are fairly specific, but for now, just a big picture question that kind of builds on what Steve Wesley has been talking about. California, in my judgment, I just want to get your reaction to that, has an accountability problem. I mean, we are, the fourth largest economy in the world. We've got, we're the wealthiest state in the nation. And yet U.S. News and World Reports ranks us as 33rd in the nation in terms of the outcomes that we're producing for people, and dead last in terms of economic opportunity, which measures economic opportunity, income inequality, and affordability. So some of these progressive policies have turned out to, in fact, been very regressive. And, they've affected both ends of the spectrum, people who are leaving and taking their tax base with them. And I really strongly encourage you to listen to what Steve has had to say, because that trend is accelerating. And we have the data to support that. And what we do as a state is, when we see that we're not producing the outcomes that we'd like to be producing, what we do is throw more money at them. I mean, this governor, and I'm not taking shots at Gavin, but since Governor Newsom took office, general fund expenditures have increased by 64%. Now, you correct me if that number is wrong, but I believe that's right. That's just not sustainable. And so my question is, from an LAO perspective, how do you get that more in balance so that, in fact, the progressive outcomes that we'd like to see generated come back to us, because they're not being generated today. They're terrible.
Yeah. Well said. A lot of what you're saying is correct. You're accurate on the expenditure growth rate that you talk about is factual. But what I would just say is it's actually a revenue story. So what happened is we had such strong revenue growth in those years, basically throughout Governor Newsom's tenure until recently. There's such strong revenue growth. The spending is basically mirroring that revenue growth, and it has to go somewhere. Like I said, even money that they put into the rainy day fund counts as an expenditure. So I can tell you that out of $202 billion of estimated surpluses that the state had in the 3 fiscal years before this, the state only allocated $11 billion to new ongoing spending. The thinking was, if we put almost all of it to one-time spending, we are protected in the event that the revenues go down or whatever. But like I said, it's obviously still baked into the plan, and it's contributing to the deficits we show. So it's not sufficient. It may be necessary, but not sufficient to take that step. And even the 11 billion, which is a small share of the 202 billion in surplus, that's going to grow to 25 billion within a few years, the cost of maintaining those services. So every ongoing dollar is going to have a growth factor. Now, you're completely right to raise a question about, well, what are we getting for the money? And that's a question that we have been raising in our hearings with the legislature, that it's one thing to spend the money, but we really also there's a capacity issue. There's been we had such large surpluses that there was almost too not enough capacity of state government to implement all of these program ideas effectively. And so what we had been suggesting is to have the state, and the legislature focus more on oversight and the implementation of programs and the effectiveness. And so, I think whether it was fully embraced at that time, I think now is certainly an opportunity to turn our attention that way. You're correct about some of the socioeconomic challenges the state faces are really very stark and, very troubling. And we're doing some work in different areas around those issues as well, trying to highlight where maybe things are falling short and not working in terms of outcomes the way we would hope. So anyway, that's kind of what I think of when I hear your question, Peter.
Thank you, Gabe.
Right, Pete, thank you. Hey, so we're about to wrap up. I did want to interject one other topic just in the last 2 minutes we have that we haven't touched on. I guess Gabe did obliquely, which is education and the impacts on education spending. So Gabe, I think that our education budget this year is on the order of 128 billion or so. The automatic spending reductions you talked about 4 billion, so meaningful, but as a percentage fairly small. But potentially the legislature could do more than that if they chose to. This is where for many people, a deficit becomes real, is when their schools are impacted. So it affects the politics, it affects the room that we would have to do different types of fiscal reforms. How do the reductions that you propose as a possibility, up to 20 billion or so, how do those compare to past education spending reductions, where we've seen pink slips and things of that nature?
Yeah, so in the past, the state has a pretty long track record of always reducing the Proposition 98 level down to the minimum guarantee. I don't have, they've avoided, but then they've implemented at the same time deferrals so that the schools kind of continue to operate without as much disruption, and then phase in the reductions over a couple of years. I don't want to speculate. I don't have a comparative number just off the top of my head. The idea that we're talking about would allow them to maintain the prior year budget, only swap out general fund and replace it with the use of that 98 reserve that I mentioned. And then going forward, we'd have a somewhat lower base. But the other thing the K-12 in particular population enrollment numbers, demographically, that's a slower growing area of our population. And so our enrollment trends have actually been flatter and declining. So there's some relief built into the projections for the K-12 districts. It's statewide I'm talking, so it's not even across the districts. But you couple that with they have had historically high levels of funding in recent years, we think it shouldn't be too much of a budget crisis. So,
okay, Gabe,
I have another meeting at 1 o'clock that I have to go to. So,
well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks everyone.
In touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks. Great questions. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.